The truck rolled into the yard before sunrise. The driver cut the engine and listened to the metal settle. A crane hook swung once in the cold air and tapped the side wall. A crate came down hard enough to wake the pigeons on the roof line. Men in grey coats stepped close and read the stencils by the light of a single bulb. One word was all anyone cared about: Maschinenpistol. They pried the crate open with crowbars that had their own scars. Inside lay a bundle of tubes and a bundle of hope. The bundle looked like the British answer they had spent years cursing over the Channel. It looked like a Sten that had learned a few German words on the way to the bench. A simple tube for a receiver. A simple bolt that ran on its own weight. A magazine that went straight up from below, not sideways from the left. A wire butt. A barrel that could be cut and threaded in an afternoon. The model number was new, but the idea was not. MP3008. Men in the yard turned it over without ceremony. They checked that the bolt moved. They checked that the magazine locked. One pulled on the wire stock to see if it would survive a fall. Another looked at the feed lips on a magazine and frowned. The frown did not leave his face for the rest of the week. The order that gave life to this weapon was as short as a prayer. Build something cheap. Build something fast. Feed it with 9 by 19 mm. Make it shoot when a man who had never touched a submachine gun pulled the trigger. Make it so simple that a shop that made stove pipe last month could stamp the parts. Make it with steel that still existed in the bins. Make it with welders who had learned under falling sparks and falling roofs. The answer was a copy that was not a clone. The British had made the Sten so that a nation with full factories could make more guns for less money. The Sten worked best in the hands of men who could swap a bent magazine for a straight one without delay. The Sten lived inside a supply system that could afford to throw bad parts away. The Sten had time to settle into a standard pattern after the first rough months. Germany in the last year of the war did not have that time. It had drawings that felt like a shortcut and a calendar that refused bargains. Engineers drew a straight line from problem to solution. Blow back, open bolt. A return spring that would be simple wire. A fixed firing pin on the bolt face. A magazine that came up from below so shooters would not crush the magazine with their palm. A simple trigger with a long sear engagement. A safety notch on the bolt to keep it from running if a man tripped and slammed the stock into a wall. Every piece would be stamped, cut, filed, or welded with the least pain. No milled surfaces if a stamped one would do. No machined blocks if a bent plate could take its place. Every gram of steel would work for a living. They built the first batch and took them to a berm where they could be rude. The test plan was simple. Load a magazine, fire a few rounds on single, fire a few short bursts. Fire a long string until the barrel tooled its own temper into a dull red. Change magazines and do it again with a different lot of ammunition. Note what breaks. Note what stops. The first morning felt like a success. The guns barked to life with the steady rhythm of a simple plan. Spent cases asked in neat patterns. Smoke hung low. The ejection port spit brass until the dirt around the test line glinted. The bolts came back with enough energy to hammer the buffer with a note that sounded honest. Men nodded and wrote phrases like "it fires and it feeds." Then the afternoon arrived. The testers did not change anything in the plan. The plan changed itself. One gun began to dribble cases back into the ejection port. The bolt face picked up a smear of brass that grew with each stroke. The extractor chipped and spat out a crescent you could hold up to the light. The return spring on another gun lost a little of its will in the heat. The cyclic tempo drifted. The bolt began to outrun the magazine once every second magazine. The shooter felt 2 shots and then a click. The shooter looked down at a round, half stripped from the stack and jammed flat against the feed ramp. Another gun gave a different complaint. The weld that held the magazine well to the receiver looked neat. It was not strong. A drop to the bench bent the mouth of the well a hair. That small change turned the feed angle into a small lyre. The next magazine ran for 4 rounds, and then sent a round nose first into the wall of the chamber mouth. A man with a file could fix it in 5 minutes, if he had time and good eyes. A man in a foxhole would not have either. The notes that evening sounded like a confession. Crude weld seams opened under heat. Return spring lost force. Extractor chipped. Sear surfaces peened. Magazine feed lips inconsistent. Ejector geometry not consistent from one maker to the next. Cyclic rate not consistent across samples. The phrase it fires became it sometimes fires. The phrase it sometimes fires became it sometimes fires when the stars are aligned, and the magazine is perfect, and the spring is fresh. The problem did not live in one part. The problem lived in the space between all the parts. A simple blowback submachine gun is a study in compromise. The bolt must have enough mass to delay opening until the pressure drops. The spring must have enough force to return the bolt with authority. The feed lips must present around at a height and an angle that agree with the bolt face and with the mouth of the chamber. The extractor must bite with a depth that is not too timid and not too cruel. The ejector must meet the base of the case at a point that gives the right flick and not a drag. None of those tasks are difficult alone. All of them are fragile when built under stress. Factories tried to hold the line with fixtures and gauges. They had a line of small shops building parts, with whatever jigs those shops could manage. The receiver tube that looked like a simple cylinder was not always round when it arrived. A squeeze in a shipping crate could make it oval by a shadow of a millimeter. That shadow could slow a bolt on one stroke and not on the next. The magazine, well, that looked like a square, was not always square. A jig that allowed a millimeter of play allowed a weapon to be born with trouble in its throat. The return spring was wire in a circle. It needed steel with a temper that held. It needed a heat treatment that did not change when the furnace had a bad day. Many springs did not get that kindness. They softened in the first hour of a hard test. The cyclic tempo sagged. A shooter felt the stock thrum in a way that said the spring was becoming a passenger. Welds told their own story. A good weld is an honest seam that holds in silence. A bad weld is a seam that keeps a small secret. The small secret in many MP 3008 receivers was that the man at the torch was new, or tired, or rushing. A torch that burns a little too cool gives a seam that looks right and tears early. A torch that burns a little too hot makes a seam that cools brittle. A fold in a corner holds a bubble that a man cannot see. The bubble cracks when the gun rattles at several hundred revolutions per minute, and the crack grows, but little with every shot. Magazines were the real villains and also the easiest scapegoats. A blowback gun can forgive a scratch inside a receiver. It cannot forgive a bad magazine. The magazine body must hold shape. The feed lips must be mirror twins. The spring must push the follower with the same will on round 30 as on round 5. None of those requirements are exotic. All of them were hard to meet when the press that cut the bodies had worn edges, when the gauge that checked lip width had lost its truth, and when the wire for springs came from lots that were not equal. A magazine that was a shade narrow bound the follower when dust got inside. A magazine that was a shade wide allowed rounds to nose dive under rebound. Feed lips that were a fraction too open sprayed rounds high. Feed lips that were a fraction too tight scraped brass and made each round pay a toll it could not afford. The MP 3008 did not come with a box of perfect magazines tied to each gun. It came with a grab bag from many workshops. The bag included saints and sinners. A soldier did not know which he had until the loud moment. The design choice to place the magazine vertical under the receiver had logic. It kept hands from crushing the magazine sideways. It centered weight. It simplified the feed angle if the well was true. It also made the weld seam between well and receiver a point of fate. A drop on a stone step, a kick during a retreat, a jump into a ditch, any of these could bend the mouth by a whisper. That whisper became a shout when the next burst tried to run. Some samples came with a wood stock that looked simple and strong. Some came with a wire stock that folded. Some came with no stock at all, only a loop to brace against a sling. Variations kept the design alive on paper. Variations killed it slowly in practice. A new stock meant a new jig. A new jig meant a new chance for a misaligned seam. A new seam meant a new failure that would not show up until a boy who needed a working gun pressed the trigger and got a short click. The trigger group wanted kindness that the last year of the war did not give. A simple submachine gun trigger has a sear that catches a notch on the bolt. The sear must be hard. The notch must be hard. The angles must match. The contact must be smooth. Soft sear pins. A soft notch rounds. The next burst becomes a runaway string. A runaway string turns a careful shooter into a man wrestling a hose. That can be amusing on a range. It becomes a crime in a hallway or behind a low wall. Test teams saw all of these sins. They also saw something worse. The sins did not repeat in the same way on the same day. One sample would feed from a bad magazine and then choke on a good one after dust settled. Another would run on full power ammunition and choke on a lot that was a hair light. Another would run perfectly clean and then show a failure to eject the first time a cloud of grit kissed the bolt rails. The inconsistency was a verdict by itself. You can picture a meeting where officers sat around a table and read those notes. Some wanted to cancel and move to another pattern. Some said that any gun is better than no gun when you are out of men and time. The decision that emerged was not elegant. Keep building. Try to standardize parts where possible. Issue what you can. Trust to luck. Train men to avoid touching the magazine as a handle. Issue spare magazines if you have them. Tell troops to test each magazine with a full load before a patrol. That last instruction was honest. It also admitted defeat. The MP 3008 went to troops who were not all soldiers in the old sense. It went to boys and older men. It went to police units. It went to guards. It went to men who had never stripped a gun on a rainy day. It went to men who did not know what a feed lip felt like when it was correct. It went to men who had no spare parts and no spare time. A boy with a new MP 3008 stood behind a stone wall at a crossroads. He had one spare magazine in a pocket that was not meant for metal. He had a pouch with 50 rounds of 9 by 19mm from a lot that had been loaded in a hurry. He had been told that the gun must run with a clean magazine and a steady shoulder and a light thumb on the trigger. He had been told many things. He had remembered a few. When the first soldiers came around the corner, he raised the gun and pressed the trigger in short bursts. The first rounds left the muzzle with the quick cough that makes a man bold. The wire stock flexed under his cheek. The bolt slammed and returned. The gun felt like a tool that did not care about him. Then the fifth round jammed against the ramp. His finger pulled twice and begged. The bolt tried and failed. He yanked the magazine and slammed it back. He racked the bolt and saw brass bounce in the port. He pressed again. The gun ran for 3 more rounds and stopped. A slow fear replaced courage. He went to the second magazine and hoped it would be one of the good ones. There were guns that did better. There were guns that did far worse. The worst were the ones that ran away with a rope of fire after the first controlled burst. Those guns had sears that peened early. They had notches that rounded in a single string. The next time a shooter let the bolt ride forward, the fixed firing pin met a primer without waiting for orders. The gun emptied itself, and then the shooter could command it again. No manual had a line for that moment. There were guns that showed an opposite sin. They doubled and then refused to fire at all. The fixed firing pin had a small burr. The bolt closed a little slower on a round that dragged on a magazine lip. The burr struck and did not ignite. The next pull of the trigger sent the bolt forward with more will. The primer lit. The rhythm could not be trusted. The shooter felt like he was calling out numbers, and in a broken rhythm, and the gun only repeated some of them. The British Sten was no saint. Early Stens jammed. Early Stens shook themselves into shame with loose parts and poor welds. Early Stens had magazines that bent like cans. But British factories had time to beat those sins out of the line. They had inspectors who could stand with a gauge and send a lot back without fear. They had presses that could be resharpened. They had wire that could be drawn again with better temper. They had fuel for the furnaces. They had spares. They had the luxury of making a cheap gun in a rich way. Germany tried to make a cheap gun in a poor way. The MP 3008 was an honest attempt by men who could see the end of the road. It worked in a test the day it was switched on. It worked in the hands of a good armourer with a good box of magazines and a bottle of oil. It worked in a quiet hour on a clean bench. It failed in field hands too often to matter. Engineers know why. A simple mechanism can be the most sensitive to small lies. When you remove all the extra measures that help a machine survive bad days, you leave the machine with no buffer. A heavy bolt will forgive a weak spring for a few hundred cycles. A light bolt will not. A generous feed cone at the chamber mouth will forgive a magazine that feeds a shade low. A sharp mouth will not. A strong extractor claw will pull a case out of a dirty chamber and not complain. A small claw will snap or will slip. Every cheap choice must be balanced by a careful choice somewhere else. If you are out of careful choices, the drawing that looked beautiful will ask for mercy that the world will not give. This is why the weapon could be accurate at 10 paces and treacherous at 15. This is why men wrote that it fired, and then wrote that it sometimes fired. This is why inspectors, who watched the first batch smile would watch the third batch, with tired eyes. This is why one shop's guns had a cyclic tempo near 500 revolutions per minute, and another shop's guns ran nearer 700. This is why no two bolts weighed the same within a margin that mattered. This is why some receivers swallowed dust and kept running while others choked in an hour. The last months brought more variation, not less. The butt one week was wire. The butt another week was wood. The magazine catch changed shape. The front sight changed shape. The rear notch went from one width to another. A soldier who found a spare part might find that it would not fit his sample. A man who hoped for a second magazine might find a different maker's stamp, and a body that wanted a different well. A platoon sergeant who tried to sort his pile of magazines by feel could not. He had to load them and fire them, and then tie a string to the good ones. In some units the weapon stayed in the rack while men carried old rifles that were slow and honest. A bolt action that closes every time is not a consolation prize when your life depends on a first shot. That leaves the barrel. Some men carried the MP3008 as a noisemaker for the first seconds of a fight, and then relied on the sidearm that came from a better factory and a better year. They did what men always do with poor tools. They made rules that limited the harm. There are stories that do not make it into manuals, but live in mess halls. One squad learned to strip the magazines down and polish the inside seam with fine paper. They learned to check spring length by laying the spring across the back of a hand. They learned that a spring that sags a finger width in the middle is done. They learned to make a small gauge from a piece of scrap to test feed lip width. They learned to ignore the stamp and watch the fit. The gun still failed too often. The squad still felt better doing something. Another group filed a larger chamfer at the mouth of the chamber by hand. They believed it helped. They may have been right for their samples and wrong for others. A third group bent the magazine well a hair with a wooden block to pull it into square. Their guns ran better. The squad in the next building tried the same trick and cracked the seam. The same act becomes a fix or a sin when the overlap and the weld change by a whisper. The MP3008 did what it could. It proved that a line drawing is not a machine. It proved that a machine is not a weapon until 1,000 machines act the same on a dirty day. It proved that copying is not cloning. The idea of a simple tube and a simple bolt and a simple magazine is a good idea. The idea becomes a weapon only when the tube is true, when the bolt mass is steady, when the springs are honest, when the magazines are interchangeable, and when spares exist. Instructors wrote lessons that fit on one page and learned to say them without bitterness. Do not hold the magazine as a grip. Load each magazine to full and test it. Keep the feed lips clean and smooth. Keep the bolt rails oiled but not wet. Check the safety notch by dropping the butt on a pad before you leave the barracks. If the gun runs away, hold it tight and point it safe until it empties. If the gun doubles, bring it to the bench. If the gun fails to eject, stop and clean the extractor and the port. These lessons helped. They did not make the weapon into a Sten that a veteran would trust. Some officers argued for a different path. They said the nation should have focused on a single pattern earlier and built it under control. They said that even a simple weapon requires a culture of inspection. They said the betters. Tragic choice would have been to keep the old submachine gun patterns in limited numbers, and to focus the rest of the energy on ammunition and training. Perhaps they were right. The calendar had already taken away the time to test rival theories. The war ended while piles of receiver tubes sat on pallets. Crates of springs remained sealed. Magazines lay in baskets with paper tags that named shops that never built anything else again. Allied teams walked through those yards and took notes. They took a few samples. They fired a few magazines and smiled at the shape of the concept and frowned at the behavior of the reality. They wrote that it was a Sten look-alike, with a vertical magazine that worked when it wanted, and failed when a man needed a better friend. Historians who care about small arms understand the real lesson. A design that looks right can still go wrong if the factory cannot hold the promise. Quality control and spares are not details that you add when the gun is done. They are the spine that holds the gun upright in the world. The MP3008 tried to stand without that spine. It took a few steps. It fell in the field. If you pick one up today in a museum, you will feel the aim of the men who made it. The receiver is light. The balance is honest. The sights are plain. The trigger is long and safe if the sear is hard. You can pull the bolt back and feel a smooth run on a sample that was made on a good day. You can lock it in the safety notch and feel hope. You can release it and feel the spring push with a will that might last. You can insert a magazine and trust that this one, in glass and in peace, will feed. A curator will tell you that many did not. He will tap the weld seam on the well and say a small thing moved the path of many rounds that year. He will show you a bin of magazines with slight differences that only a careful man would notice. He will put an arm around a group of students and say that the machine is a case study, not a relic of glory. He will say there is no shortcut through the factory. He will say that men who go to war with a copy need the same steel, the same gauges, and the same spare parts as the men who made the original. The British Sten became better because it had those friends. The German MP3008 did not. It worked. Then it failed in field hands. It became a story that engineers tell when someone says that the drawing will save time. It became a reminder that the best plan in the world is a rumor until a factory can make it real again and again on hard days. The yard where the crate came down is quiet now. The pigeons still sit on the roof line. The crane hook still taps metal when the wind is strong. The men who bent the first tubes and struck the first arcs are gone. The guns that ran did so for a short hour. The guns that failed did so for the same reasons most machines fail. They were born into a family without food. They were asked to carry weight that was not fair. They were symbols that could not shoot their way out of the truth. If you write a line to pin above your workbench, write this. A copy can save design time. A copy cannot save a collapsing supply chain. Quality control and spares are not luxuries. They are the weapon. Without them, a submachine gun is a metal promise that breaks in a foxhole. With them, even a simple tube and a simple bolt can serve a man in the worst hour of his life. Men in grey coats once stood around a crate and stared at a bundle of hope. They got the first wish. It fired. They did not get the second wish. It fired when needed. The difference lives in the space between a drawing and a factory. That space is where wars are lost quietly, one jam at a time. Subscribe for more untold stories of the Second World War.